Sasha Abram is a design researcher working in service design and social innovation. She's a Master's of Design in Sustainability, Strategy and Enterprise from UTS, and she is currently completing a Master's by Research looking at the potential for service design in the delivery of creative services in a remote Indigenous community in the Central Desert. Sounds interesting, we might have to get you back. She runs an annual Kaikoura Global Studio at UTS and more recently has taught an introduction to transition design at UNSW Art and Design with Cameron, and she also works at Westpac as a design researcher in the customer-centred design team. So we've invited Sasha to come to bring a practice lens to the conversation because she's a practicing designer. So maybe if you don't mind, Sasha, to just tell us a little bit about yourself, just to kind of contextualise your experience.
Great, thanks, Jo. Hi, everyone. Kees already brought a kind of practitioner lens in a very articulate way to this conversation. I guess I am here maybe because I sit with one foot in each at the moment, one in academia and one in practice, for a large financial services organisation that I can't speak about at all and do not represent at all in this conversation tonight. Yeah, no. I guess the other thing for me is teaching this course to students this semester and really getting an understanding of how little students, certainly Sydney-based, Paddington-located students, had any ability for relational thinking. And I think that was quite shocking, actually, in a way. They're in their third year of their design degrees. And I've taught also at UTS for the last 5 or 6 years, so comparatively less relational thinking than UTS students. But I guess for me that is a nice angle to come into this discussion, which sits in the postures and mindset space more and flips that model to say, how do we as people, before we're designers, approach our lives and approach change within ourselves? What are our relationships like with our families, our neighbours, our colleagues, our parents, our bodies? How do we treat ourselves in the context of change before we then go out to make change in our communities, in our workplaces, in our social systems? Westpac Group has 40,000 employees. So who am I to dictate change to them if I'm not practicing that in my own life? And I was actually at acupuncture today in my corporate lunch break. Not perfect, but trying. And so I think it's a really interesting discussion. Students, there's so much potential, but there's also a lot of challenges, I think, in grounding them in kind of how they sit within the systems of their own lives. So I guess that's my starting point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I thought it might be good to sort of kick off with any sort of responses to Kees' response. Mm-hmm. I've noted down a couple of Kees' questions as well. I'm sure he can elaborate on them. But some of the questions that Kees asked: how does design need to change to do this at all? Who are the people that need to be involved? And we can see the value of design, but are we the right ones to do it, being designers? And if this is new, is designer the right word? So that was just a few of the questions that I heard. So maybe, Terry, would you like to?
Yeah, sure. Well, I was just saying to Kees, I thought it was a really nice response. Lots of good questions brought up. I think in terms of how does design have to change to do this work, that is the essential question, but I do want to qualify it and say we never intended for this to be an imperative for all of design to change to aim itself at transition. What we felt was needed was an area of focus within the design disciplines that would that would aim itself at helping to constitute systems level change. And when we were redesigning the curriculum at Carnegie Mellon, we really stupidly and naively thought, oh, we'll just design every program at every level. And in hindsight, we were like nuts to do that. But we did it. And now that we've done it, we're glad we did it. But part of the impetus there was to think about the way I think most of us over the age of 40 in the room, maybe 45, were educated. And if you use the metaphor of the T-shaped designer, where the vertical represents the depth of your expertise and the crossbar represents the breadth of your experience and ability to connect with other disciplines, most of us were educated way down in the depths of that T. You know, I went off to Switzerland, did a master's degree to study with somebody who was having me put teeny pieces of tissue paper between 6-point type, you know, to get the letter spacing right. It was way down there. And then over the course of a career, many of us work our way up and get to the point where maybe you're just, oh, I'm a designer, I'm not a typographer anymore, I'm not an information designer anymore, which is where the crux of my expertise is really at. I'm just a designer and I want to work on new, more complex problems because that's how I evolved. But I look back and think, you know what? I think I always had a proclivity to work there, but I wasn't able to work there because of the way I was educated. So one of the things we thought about in designing the new curriculum is, can we provide different pathways through the curriculum so that people that would just naturally occupy a space higher in that vertical stroke could do that from the beginning. And I think there are people that come along that want to work in design that maybe don't want to be in the depth of the T, and they don't want to work on projects, but they've got some other kind of design ability. So we actually think in constituting this new area of design focus, it will draw the people toward it that have that proclivity anyway. And it's like when I show up in Ojai, I know I'm not working on a project, and I know that I am not orchestrating. I'm bringing a certain attitude and a certain understanding of materiality and perhaps a certain understanding of complexity and how people work in groups and just user needs, I suppose, that translate into something more than user needs. I'm going to show up around a table with a lot of other people and bring what I have to bear on this really big, daunting problem. And I actually think this is something that every discipline needs to be thinking about. And where were we at recently? Gideon and I, we went to Utah, and we were talking to urban planners and ecologists, or urban ecologists, and we all know that in the food chain of design, designers are way down here and architects are way up here. But these people were actually quite open to us, and I said, I think for a period of time, constituting a new area of focus like this will attract fringe dwellers. And I've always felt like a fringe dweller. I never wanted to stay squarely in design because, for me, it just wasn't fulfilling what I needed to do. So I think it's not that design, perhaps all of design has to change, although it is. And I think it's evolving in really interesting ways. What I'm more interested in is constituting a new territory in which perhaps the fringe dwellers or the people that have a natural proclivity to pull up around a table with people from really different disciplines and be one of many instead of the expert. An area like that we could work in.
Sasha, did you want to have any sections?
I think the fringe dweller thing is a really great point. I have also always felt like a fringe dweller, and my previous career was in fashion design, one of the more unethical industries of design, I would argue. I can say that out loud. I think by default, because, transition design is in this social shift space, which isn't defined, that everyone in this room is probably feeling in some way like a fringe dweller who's looking to participate or wanting to create something new, but that thing doesn't quite exist yet. And that's really hopeful. I think that's very interesting. I think the cracks, that's where the light gets in.
I'm noticing you're scribbling there.
Yeah. Sort of fringe dwelling, definitely. I mean, a lot of innovation these days happens between fields rather than in fields. And in a way, design is no exception to that. It's just one of those fields that has its own professional history. It has its own territory that it's carved out. And people identify with being a certain kind of designer. And I think for the kind of stuff that we're talking about here, that does get in the way. And to put in one more case study, earlier this year I was in Holland because I was working on a big project on radicalization in Arnhem, not Arnhem land, but the city Arnhem in the east of the country. So you go from here to sort of basically a sort of neighborhood cafe and talk to some people there. And I was there with a group of designers, supposedly famous and very good designers, selected by the government and paid by the government to deal with radicalization, because design was going to deal with radicalization. So I went in there and I immediately saw a very big problem, which was, he's called Melvin. Melvin is an Islamic guy, sort of beautiful long dress, nice long beard, and he's basically the solution to radicalization. He's 24, but he's gone through a lot in his life. He used to be a professional footballer, got injured, went down, managed to get up again. He's a youth worker now. He's got an immensely good connection to all of these kids. He knows exactly what goes on in their lives and which transitions they're going through and when they're vulnerable for influence, etc., etc. So he's just absolutely fabulous and completely amazing. And you think, well, there's a couple of problems. One is he's not very reflective. He just does this. A lot of the things that he does, he can do because he does them. The authenticity behind it is just overwhelming. And the problem is we need 1,000 of him, of one. And he doesn't scale up. Although he does get fatter every time that I see him. That doesn't help. So I basically went in there with this group of designers. And so I basically sat down with him and talked with him for about 4 days, thinking about, okay, what does he actually do? What are his practices? And are there some of these practices that he already does that you could give a shape so that other people could do that too? Not to make it official or whatever, but at least to make it transportable, because he's doing so much good stuff. And there's a whole lot of stuff that nobody else can touch because it's really him doing it. And but I was there with this group of paid designers, and they interviewed him for 10 minutes, and they thought that them would know everything that he knows. And you think, that's arrogant. It's very stupid. Coming in as the creative, and the knowledge that they needed was actually right in front of them. And they had no way of accepting that into their own process. So I fired them.
Awesome.
And Melvin has now set up his own design lab. He calls it the design lab. He just sort of basically squatted in his place that he knew. And he's working with the kids there, and he's doing really well. And you think, okay, that's where design misses the beat completely. And how do we get our students, new designers, into a space that they wouldn't do that? Or is it other fields that should develop up their own creative process where designers can meet them in that kind of space? What is this kind of area that we're talking about? And with the designers they were good designers and nothing wrong about them. They were just in the wrong place for what they brought, in a sense. And they were identifying with lots of things that had to do with the form of design, but for me, not with the content of design. If it is for other people, you have to really deeply listen and understand those other people. And not just, and also accept and very much respect the expertise that's already out there in society for the kind of things that we want to do. it may be there in the wrong shape and it may be locked into bad habits, etc., but the expertise is there to a large degree. So how can we learn to listen?
Yeah.
And how can we develop up that ability much better? And whether we call it design then or not, I don't care, actually. It doesn't matter.
You know what this makes me think of a bit is, I think this is a great story. So we tried to teach just an introduction of transition design to our fourth-year undergraduate students this year. And even though when Cameron was there, he designed a really beautiful design study spine that goes right up the curriculum from the undergrad to the master's level. The undergrads kept saying, how come we don't get anything to do with transition design? And it's just the age-old thing. Well, we don't get it, so we want it. And we kept saying, we're not sure we're ready to give that to you yet. And they were really insistent. So we did a mini in the first half. And it sparked a really interesting conversation with them, because when they were introduced to this radically large context, and we gave them different Pittsburgh-related problems, like I mentioned, crime or lack of access to affordable housing and so on. By the time they'd been through the arc of the experience I laid out in the lecture, and they, were working with Stuart Candy on visioning, there were a few of them that were like, I don't think I want to do this. And we had to say, fair enough, the world needs designers who are going to make things that work well and that solve needs, satisfy needs. But here's the experiment I suppose we're all in. If you are exposed to this radically large context and you are made more aware of the interconnections and interdependencies at all these different levels of scale, will it change the way you approach the design of the tangible thing or the design of the interface, even slightly, because you were made aware of a context which is much bigger? And it led to a very interesting debate. And I think most of the seniors ended up thinking, maybe. So that segment ended a few weeks ago, and in the last half of the semester, they had to then design an intervention. Actually, no, they had to design an artifact that was within an intervention in the system. And we had to be very candid with them and say, this may not work, and they were mounting the senior show just as I was leaving in our university gallery. And Gideon and I went in before it opened. And they had somehow transported all the Post-it notes and all the scribbles on the wall onto this wall. And they did a really interesting thing. They cut out plexiglass and they had descriptive narratives about what those Post-it notes meant and how it changed the way they thought about the design of the particular thing they were going to make. So it has got all of us thinking about the fact that not everybody has to work this way, but perhaps, just perhaps, the thing about design that maybe needs to change is the awareness of the bigger context, even if at the end of the day, you're just going to design this thing here. That awareness will change the trajectory, perhaps.
They're very nice, by the way.
They're kind of nice.
Yeah.
Fashion design.
Sorry.
Yeah, okay.
I have a question. Can I ask? So in the context of whether design or designers are appropriate or fit to do this kind of work, I'm wondering if you both consider yourself optimists, and if so, why?
Shall I answer first?
You go first. Yeah.
I would say that in the short term, in the day-to-day, nobody's ever accused me of being an optimist, have they? I am a realist, I would say. I'm always preparing for the worst and hoping for the best, which I think is. But I would say in the long term, ever since I went to Schumacher College and I did this thing called a master's in holistic science, and we studied chaos and complexity theory and principles of emergence. Studying chaos and complexity theory actually made me a longer-term optimist. Because when I learned that complex open systems these things called phase transitions, remember, well, not everybody in here does. A few of you remember when the Berlin Wall fell. Who remembers? A few of you do. The fall of the Berlin Wall felt like it came out of nowhere. I mean, just boom. And I was running a company at the time whose main office was in Berlin. And it was like, oh my God, the wall's fallen. How the hell did that happen? Well, actually, what had been happening is tiny little imperceptible changes in the system at the molecular level had been percolating around. And then all of a sudden, it's like when the temperature drops and water suddenly goes from a liquid to a solid, boom, phase transition. Well, the same thing happens in social systems. So my great optimism is that if enough of us start thinking about these things, and if enough of us start shifting our practices, or we start shifting the way designers are educated, but actually this conversation has to happen within every discipline, every profession. If all of these subtle, almost imperceptible changes start happening, we could have a phase transition. So in the long term, I think I'm actually an optimist hoping for that.
Kees, you want to answer that first? I have a question.
Okay, yeah, I can do a quick one. I've been a little bit disappointed with design schools on the whole, because they're kind of copying machines. People go in there and they teach in the way that they were taught, but by their best tutors, and that's how it works. So design, although it's all about innovation and new stuff, is actually very slow in changing itself, because a lot of that is very implicit. So I ended up starting a new degree here at UTS called the Bachelor of Creative Intelligence, which is a double degree. So students do one of 25 bachelor degrees at UTS. And in summer schools and winter schools, they get basically a course that is about innovation between fields. Taking practices from all different kinds of fields, all 25 different bachelor degrees, about how do they reach innovation, how do they deal with complexity, etc., etc. Just throwing those at those students. And underneath that whole curriculum, although I'm not supposed to say that, are actually design processes. It is very much, in a way, it is a design degree. But it has to be owned by all those other fields. As soon as you call it a design degree, it becomes a design thing. And this is actually about dealing with complex issues in society for which you need all of those expertises together. So we call it creative intelligence because nobody knows what that means. And so there is real optimism there, and the degree has been quite spectacular. So this year we had 4,000 applicants for 150 places. Got people flying out from Silicon Valley just to work with our students for a couple of days, etc. It is clearly where everybody understands that the problems in the world are very connected and need to be approached in that way, rather than choosing to be either this or that. And I can see design being a very good basis for that kind of transdisciplinarity, for pulling in all of these others too. And I don't see design schools doing that at all, because they're all focused on you're either a product designer or a graphic designer, and et cetera, et cetera. And that's the wrong way around. I mean, if you're a company, you try to mirror what is your environment. And if your environment becomes more open, complex, dynamic, and networked, you have to become more open, complex, dynamic, and networked. I think design schools haven't understood yet how their own environment has actually changed already. And they're very slow learners.
We kind of same I touched on and are starting engaging with it slightly. I have an optimism. I'm an optimist about design, about the change of things that we're talking about. It borrows and evolves and changes regularly, and that's one of the great things about it as a discipline. As a practitioner who works with organisations who build up the experiences that people have in the world across different skills, and we can do work across different skills. We've only just begun to see the maturity in some organisations where they'll accept design and use design or understand how to use these kinds of designs as a tool to have the kind of impact that we're talking about. I'm talking about from the service and human-centered design perspective. And my kind of question is, it's great that we have this conversation within the design disciplines and practices, but how do we scale and disperse that conversation, and we briefly touched on it, across different disciplines and different practices, so that we can see the maturity in organizations and the constructs that shape our world, be aware of how to use transition design, and pay people to do it, essentially. That's what we need to happen.
Well, that's one of the reasons that I mentioned that my hope would be that transition studies, this whole idea that transition is an imperative, might crop up on university campuses, and it would be a very natural sort of transdisciplinary place for people to meet. I've been amazed at how that idea of transition seems to capture people's imagination. And I think that if you got different disciplines coming together on university campuses, I don't know what the counterpart in practice would be, but I think you need people orienting around something with meaning like that in order to bring them together.
I want to currently say that's agile. I know that sounds like a cliche, but agile lean comes from a manifesto that is actually about interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary collaboration towards a collective outcome, recognizing everyone is equal and a contributor within that process. It has been adopted to facilitate innovation for large organizations to increase, generally their revenue. But fundamentally, philosophically, I think that's one way it's happening in the world now, and it includes design.
Service design is about 28 years old when you think about it. But we said social innovation really begins to poke and challenge those dominant socio-economic political paradigms. But we very intentionally said transition design calls for a complete reconception of those. So in other words, if we're looking at the long-term future and how the socio-economic political paradigms work, well, you would not have a purely for-profit economic paradigm anymore. You would have transition towards something else. So I think that when it comes to business and corporations, that is going to challenge them, isn't it? Although you do see some corporations transitioning already. I mean, I was amazed when I saw the emergence of B magazine. Have any of you seen that? There's a magazine about B Corps, and Yves Chenard was on the cover of the very first issue. And I've been amazed that there's now enough B Corps on the planet that a monthly magazine can actually be written about the case studies and the way in which they're doing that. So that represents a bit of a transition. But, I mean, Cameron, I think you should chime in here too, as well.
No, I just say, I mean, we're always very clear that some of the things that we talk about in relation to transition design can equip current modes of capitalism. And so there is always a political aspect to the visions that we are promoting, which that they are what we call cosmopolitan localist, adopting discourse of other people, but that they generally, or to use Ezio Manzini's phrase, they're small, slow, local, open and connected. And that is what we're going for, and that anytime anybody is looking for anything big, that's going to be the problem. We were just having this conversation before. And therefore the objective is to always transition away from large to versions of local and small. So that would be the value proposition, and that's not going to be attractive to large conglomerations who have to meet shareholder value.
So just to add to that, I think that the temporality conversation that came up before, the tension between short-term and long-term value hasn't been resolved. Mm-hmm. Even if we aspire to long-term value, we're living in a current paradigm of short-term value. Mm-hmm. That example that comes to mind very quickly is last week I went to this social enterprise near Wollongong. It's sponsored by the Westpac Foundation, so corporate social responsibility. We'll park that for the time being. And they have a market garden. They built it on 12 acres at the back of a school in a very low socioeconomic area with very few opportunities for young people. Also has one of the highest rates of refugee resettlement in Australia. And the unemployment rate is 30% for those refugees. So they've just planted this fruit forest. It's going to take 8 years to grow. 8 years to actually get to production to actually bear fruit. Mm-hmm. And that is, they're not remotely fazed by that time frame. They're excited by it. So I think that, they're very local, they're embedded, they're creating opportunities, but they already have this future that they're creating in their present. It's really interesting.
Kees, we're nearly going to probably close it soon. I was wondering if Kees had any sort of last thoughts.
Well, sort of lots of different ones actually. Just very quickly, one of the things with complex systems is that they don't have a distinct goal. So how do you behave in a system that doesn't have a goal in itself? Mm-hmm. You work based on values and principles. That's what you do. But then design is always about you have to get a resolution, you have to reach a goal, etc. And I think stepping away from that, so stepping away in a sense from the whole notion of a problem, but intervening into a space where different things are possible, using your own principles or the principles that have been sort of that you can read from society, whether it's in OJ or somewhere else. It's going to be the new game in design, in this type of design, I think. And again, the question is, calling this design, is that useful? Or is it a design-based new practice that we have to give a real name? Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, thank you very much. I'd like to give a round of applause for all of us.